Hey everyone, today I'm going to be talking about the origins of good and evil, specifically Nietzsche's Master and Slave morality. So I recently got finished reading the Genealogy of Morals, which I think is almost a sequel to Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, or at least a refinement of some of his ideas within the book. Beyond Good and Evil was the first Nietzsche book that I actually finished, and I think it's a very good, almost magnus opus of his philosophy. And I think the Genealogy of Morals, it's in the title, the genealogy, it gets into the origins of morality, and it really delves deeper into how the master and slave morality concept developed over the course of history. Now, getting right into it, we're talking about the origins of good and evil. And obviously, when we say that, we're talking about really the origins of morality, the genealogy of morality, if you will. And of course, like almost anything else, it starts off with evolution. As you start to have collective groups forming, obviously humans are social animals, therefore they require a social hierarchy to function so that everybody knows their role, they know what they need to do. So we go back to the hunter-gatherer society, for example. There is a necessity for rules to develop social cohesiveness within a society. Obviously, without rules, if different members of the society are killing without good reason, they're killing each other without good reason, they're stealing without good reason, they're causing harm upon others without good reason, then you're going to have a lot of social instability. You need to build trust within a collective group in order for that group to be efficient with survival. Obviously, if you have more trust between different members of the society, you're going to hunt better, you're going to gather better, people are going to understand their roles, and they're going to understand that by doing their roles, they are contributing to the success of the collective group, and they are also benefiting from the collective group's success. Without this trust, and without this knowledge of what their role is within a society, the group is not going to be efficient, they're not going to be successful, and if there's a lot of distrust, then they're just not going to do their job as well. Because when you have a society, you take any like corrupt society, for example, you walk down the street, you don't know if someone's going to mug you, right? That's going to take a lot more energy towards just trying to survive amongst your own group of people, which is going to make the collective group survival when they're actually working together much more difficult. Because if you can't trust, your neighbor, you can't trust the person next to you, then how are you going to trust them to do their job well when, for example, as a tribe, you have to battle it out with other tribes, right? The tribe or the collective group that has that social cohesiveness, that has that clearly defined set of rules, is going to defeat the tribe or the collective group without that set of rules, without that morality, if you will. Because really, when you think about it, morality is just rules for living. And there's lots of different ways that you see this sort of come about, right? You have religion, you have culture. Religion and culture, and at times in conjunction with each other, tell the individual within a society what the correct way to act is, how they should interact with other members of the society. And when you have that clear set of rules, it becomes a lot easier to understand, okay, what is my role in this society? How should I interact with others? If I do this upon others, it is wrong. If I don't do this, it is wrong. And you have less of when you have a strong organic set of rules through culture or religion, then you don't need to enforce those rules through law as much, because it's kind of like, it's almost like the default setting, right? The default setting is culture or religion, and you see this a lot. It's like sort of the unspoken rule. When you have a very strong culture or strong religion that sort of dictates how you should act in a society, you have less of a necessity for laws. Culture and religion, in terms of morality, are sort of that organic morality that comes about, whereas you have laws, which is more institutionalized morality, right? That's a legal system to say, okay, especially when you have lots of different cultures or religions within a society, then you need more laws, because in one culture, for example, one thing could be correct, and in another culture, that thing could be incorrect. So if you have both these cultures in a society contending with one another, then you need laws to sort of settle that dispute. One example that comes to mind is the hijab law. So basically, in Sharia law and in many Islamic countries, women have to wear hijab covering their face and most of their body, and that's a cultural expectation, right? In many Islamic countries. But then once you have somebody from an Islamic background come to a Western country like the United States, France, England, whatever, right? Then there's this expectation of the West as well that well, you don't have to cover yourself this way to live in this society. So the law says, okay, well, the individual from an Islamic society is allowed to cover themselves, but they can also not cover themselves if they wish to do so. So this is the law that's sort of settling the differences, because while the Western woman might see that as restricting their liberty, an Islamic woman might say, well, this is part of my culture, so I should be able, and my religion, so I should be able to express my culture and religion within the society. So the law says, kind of settles both their differences by saying, if you want to wear the covering, you can, and if you don't want to wear the covering, you don't have to. So it's protecting the right to wear the covering, but also protecting the right to choose to adapt to more Western culture. So just an example of that. So that's sort of how morality developed over time, right? It's to create that set of rules for people to interact with one another, to create social cohesiveness, and to create an efficient collective group so that they can efficiently gather, they can efficiently hunt, they can efficiently battle other tribes. And then once you have the agricultural revolution, say like 12,000 years ago, roles within a society. So, okay, you have people that need to farm. They need to create this amount of yield, and other people might need to build. You need builders and you need artisans, right? And everyone has their role. And this all functions within a foundation for morality, because social hierarchy is rooted in morality. It's the idea that everyone has something they need to contribute, right? And if you slack off contributing in a certain thing, then obviously you're breaking that group's morality. You're being lazy, for example. You're not contributing to the success of the collective group. So each individual has a role, and then they have rules, and morality provides those rules, and morality can come organically, right? You have religion, you have culture, you have all these different things that contribute to that. Now, in relation to Nietzsche's most prevalent contribution to the evolution of morality comes from his identification of master and slave morality. And some people have a problem with this terminology because of the connotations to slavery. Well, he's not necessarily talking about master and slaves like the master of a slave. It's merely to illustrate this dynamic basically between the masters or nobles, which have power, and the slaves, which are weaker. And so this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with like actual slavery. For example, he's going to talk about a lot of groups that actually practice slave morality but happen to be in the top of the society. It's merely the initial creation of that morality comes from roots of power or weakness, master or slaves, and I'm going to be talking about that throughout this video. So just try not to get the actual words, try not to get stuck up on the actual words, right? Let's move past that a little bit. Essentially, the early masters in the master and slave morality dynamic were the individuals with power who created the rules. And they created those rules from a position of power. And then you have the slave class, which could become powerful later on, and I'll talk about how they did, in fact, become powerful later on, but their morality came from a position of servitude. It came from a position of being almost like slaves, and if not actual slaves, serving the powerful people. So this sort of master and slave dynamic. And one of the best examples for one of the groups that eventually became more powerful and more prominent, but came from a position of slave morality, is the early Hebrew people. So the Jewish people, and then eventually the Christian people. So Jewish and Christian religious tradition, in Nietzsche's interpretation, comes from a position of slave morality. And the reason why is because of the history of persecution and the history of actual literal slavery in the case of the Jewish people and the Hebrew people. So obviously, the Hebrew people were enslaved by the Egyptians for many years until Moses led them through the desert back to Israel, back to Palestine, to rebuild their kingdom. And for a long period of time, the Hebrew people were enslaved by the Egyptians. And essentially, in this master and slave morality dynamic, the slave class needs to find a way to justify their position of weakness, or justify their position without power, justify their position of enduring suffering. And the way that the Hebrew people did that was by saying, essentially, this, you see this later on also in the New Testament, but just starting off with the Old Testament, it's this idea that suffering in the physical world will lead to eternal salvation in the metaphysical world, which is heaven. So you suffer now on earth and you have to go through all these things, but eventually God is going to look at the people who suffered and reward them with heaven. And he's going to look at the people who abused the people who are suffering. So the powerful people who were unjust with the weak people and are going to punish them with hell. And I wrote some notes about this as well. And you see this in the New Testament as well. Blessed be the sick, blessed be the poor, the homeless, basically the Beatitudes. And I can pull up the Beatitudes right now because that was a very loose paraphrasing of the Beatitudes. But essentially what the Beatitudes say, and I'm going to read them out right now really quick because I think it illustrates this idea of slave morality. And again, don't get hung up on the actual words, right? So, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. And there's a few more, but this is just to illustrate that concept. It's this idea that those who suffer, those that have injustice done to them in this world, will be given eternal life in the next world. So that's the idea of slave morality. It's not necessarily, like I said, don't get hung up on the word. It's this idea of justifying your suffering, justifying your position of servitude in relation to the more powerful people who are doing injustice upon you. Now, like I said, eventually the sort of Judeo-Christian people and that religion, even though the early history of the Hebrew people and the early history of the Christians was one of persecution, which was one of servitude and being abused by the powerful people. In the Hebrew case, they were abused by the Egyptians as actual slaves. I believe the Babylonians also, to an extent, enslaved the Hebrew people until they were freed by the Persian king. I believe it was Cyrus that freed them when he expanded the Achaemenid Empire. But so with the Hebrews, this was their tradition of slave morality. And then with the early Christian tradition, they were obviously persecuted by the Romans. The Roman Empire persecuted the early Christians. But then, as you can see, today we have the state of Israel, which is quite powerful. So even though they come from that slave morality, they're now in a position of power. And you see the Christians eventually took over the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire under Constantine the Great became Christian, and the rest of Europe really became a bastion of Christendom. Once you have this establishment of the papacy, the papal power and papal authority over Christendom, over pretty much all of Europe. So you have slave morality, and something that's rooted in slave morality that eventually can be in a position of power. So it's really, the reason I'm mentioning is this is because the origins, however, within master and slave morality is it started off with morality coming from those who are weak and morality coming from those who are powerful. But it doesn't necessarily continue that way throughout history. But it's just the origins of that. This video is the origin of good and evil, right? Nietzsche's Master and Slave morality. So going off of that, what I want to talk about is more of how the noble morality developed. I think we'll get back to slave morality a little bit later and how it can manifest itself in really bad ways, especially today. But let's talk a bit about master morality, or the morality of the powerful. So obviously, early on in history, the strong, the powerful, were the ones who instituted these first set of rules, right? Because they were in a position of power to do so. Therefore, a lot of what their morality values is strength. It values power. It values exceptionalism and success. So a big distinction that Nietzsche makes between master and slave morality is the idea that master morality, when you have the masters creating the foundations for their morality, and I kind of wrote some things about this, which I'll kind of read off of that. It's morality created by the powerful based on values that are rooted in strength and success. So the master class chooses their enemies thereafter based on people who represent the opposite traits of the master's values. So essentially what I'm trying to get at is with master morality and the master class, they first identify their values, which are rooted in strength and power, because that's what put them in the position to create these rules in the first place. So first, they identify what they value, which is usually rooted in the strength and success and power. So they identify those values, and after that, they pick their enemies. So, for example, the enemies of those with master morality might be the weak, might be those without power, those who are kind of the ones who are not able to defend themselves against the powerful, and they pick their enemies based on that. Now, slave morality, on the other hand, is created by the weak based on values that are rooted in suffering. The slave class chooses their enemies first, and then bases their values on the opposite traits of their enemies, which you'll see, and you can see if you go back in the video, how I talked about how slave morality developed within the Judeo-Christian religion. The Hebrew people were enslaved by the Egyptians, were enslaved by the Babylonians, and were persecuted throughout their history. So their morality is based on a position of weakness. It's based on a position of, okay, well, our enemies are strong. The pharaohs are abusing us. They're stealing our labor. We're working for them for next to nothing, if not nothing. Therefore, our morality is going to be based on the opposition to our enemies. We are defining our morality in opposition to our enemies. Our enemies are the powerful. And I'll talk more about later about how this manifests itself today. But essentially, it's the idea that the masters, they have their values first. They have what they believe is right first. They develop their morality first, and they pick their enemies based on individuals who are the opposite of the traits that they value. Whereas the slaves, they pick their enemies first, and they develop their morality based in opposition to the morality of the powerful, right? And we're going to go into resentiment, which is a word that comes up a lot in the genealogy of morals, and I think is incredibly pertinent today. But so we've established that. We've established that master morality is essentially the morality of the powerful. And like I said, it doesn't mean they're powerful today. Those with slave morality, in many instances, are more powerful today. But that's the origins of it. The origins of master morality is morality based upon those in power, those with strength. And slave morality is based on those who had to endure suffering and were in a position of servitude to those with power. Therefore, they were their values are going to be based upon people who have to deal with suffering, have to work for another person, are in a position of servitude. Their enemies are the powerful, therefore their morality is generally going to be one of weakness, right? So we have that established. And then what I want to establish further is how morality really started to develop from there, right? So obviously with good and evil, generally good is what creates a cohesive society. And good is also what justifies the existence of these individuals within the society. So as we've talked about, good for the master is based on strength, it's based on power, whereas good for the good for the slave class is based upon being in a position of weakness. It's based on enduring suffering, enduring hardship, and the idea, like we saw in the Beatitudes, the idea that enduring suffering and enduring hardship is what grants you eternal reward in the afterlife. God will punish those who punished you in this life. God will send the unjust to hell after life, and they will send the individuals who had to deal with hardship and who had to deal with all this pain to heaven afterwards. So that's where the difference of good with the masters and good with the slaves come from. And it's the same with evil, right? So masters might see evil as things that lead to weakness within a society, things that lead to those without strength coming up. And for the slave class, evil is going to be the exact opposite. It's going to be based upon those who abuse their strength, who abuse their power. So if we look at I think that I'm going to continue using like Judeo-Christianity as my example for slave morality. Don't get hung up with the word. I'm a Christian too, but it is a slave morality. And you have to recognize with Nietzsche, he's very nuanced. He doesn't necessarily subscribe to either master morality or slave morality, but he's saying it how it is. And it's true, this is a morality that's based on being in a position of servitude and a position of slavery. But I'm going to continue using Judeo-Christianity as my example for this. So obviously, what the Judeo-Christian faith considers evil, we look at the New Testament, for example, with in regards to what Jesus was criticizing within the society of that time. The Pharisees were abusing were abusing the positions of power to gain wealth, to live opulent lifestyles. Therefore, he was criticizing that. So the evil was criticizing the evil of those in power, right? So the Pharisees, for example, having a lot of wealth, or just wealthy individuals in general who abuse their wealth, to put themselves in positions over another person, right? And it is interesting, though, there actually is a lot of nuance within Jesus as well, because even if you look at the whole thing where I believe I forget if it was Pharisees that asked him, or if it was just some other critics of Jesus in the New Testament asked him, in terms of like our taxes or whatever, who should we pay our taxes to? Should we pay them to Jerusalem, to Israel, or should we pay them to Rome? And Jesus, of course, says, give to Caesar's what is Caesar's and give to God's what is God's, or something along that lines. I've probably butchered that again, and I can look that up really quick, because I think that this illustrates kind of what I'm trying to talk about. So if you give me a second. So I just want to find the exact quote from the scripture. So give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. So even within Jesus, there is this nuance of sort of, we have to engage in worldly affairs, but also not compromise on the sort of what comes afterwards, the metaphysics, right? So even within the New Testament and Jesus, there is some nuance. It's not a complete bashing of, no, don't give any money to the Romans. So that perhaps is not the best example, but throughout like the New Testament and the Old Testament, there is this sort, when we identify those who are evil, they're generally displayed as being in positions of power. You look at David and Goliath. David was intelligent, but he was a lot smaller than Goliath. Goliath was this behemoth, this giant of a man, and he was very powerful. And the Philistines in that particular battle were very powerful. They were favored to defeat the Hebrews in battle. And you see a lot of throughout the Old Testament. You even look at the heroes of the Old Testament, like Samson, for example. One of the evils of Samson was actually his power, and he had his hair. I believe with Samson, it was his power was in his hair or something like that. I gotta look this up just so I'm not doing disservice to the scripture, but essentially, yeah. So his power came from his hair, and he sort of started to abuse his power until his lover, it says here, Delilah, sent by the Philistines to entice him, cut his hair while he was sleeping, and by cutting his hair, he lost his power. But there is, within this scripture, there is this sort of critique of Samson and his power, and that was sort of seen as an evil. So I guess what I'm getting at is evil from the perspective of slave morality is that of power, and specifically abusing the power, right? That's the biggest kicker there, is abusing the power, especially for personal gain and personal reward. And then as we go on, looking at how slave morality manifested itself, it's interesting because I think that, and this is my personal interpretation, one of the most prevalent master moralities throughout Europe specifically was paganism. I think within the especially with paganism being more pantheistic, there's just more nuance in regards to morality. If you look at the Greek gods, for example, they weren't necessarily good or bad. The Greek gods were very human in a way. They were selfish, they were at times corrupt, and they were at times heroic and at times evil. So I think that master morality is more prevalent in the pagan religious tradition, because they pretty much, the gods were the gods because they were powerful. It wasn't necessarily because they were good. And this is very similar in like the Germanic Norse religious tradition. And they weren't necessarily good or bad. They were powerful, however, right? And that's why they were the gods. So you see this idea that, okay, well, who's at the top? Who is at the top of the hierarchy? It's the powerful, and they're not, the Greek gods or the Norse gods, the Germanic gods, the Baltic gods weren't criticized for their positions of power. But then you look at the perspective of slave morality and the Judeo-Christianity, the Judeo-Christian God, and my God is one of justice and mercy, and is not someone who abuses his power, especially in the New Testament. This might be a little hot take, but I guess getting getting Abraham to almost sacrifice Isaac was a little bit of a power move, but the New Testament, at least, is very much illustrates this peaceful, merciful God. Obviously, in the Old Testament, there was a little more nuance, which is interesting because Nietzsche himself is actually, because he is very critical of slave morality. Even though he doesn't really pick a side, he is critical of slave morality because he feels that slave morality is more prevalent in society of his time and definitely in society today. But Nietzsche himself was actually a big fan of the Old Testament, and he felt that the Old Testament sort of illustrated more nuance, especially in regards to God and in regards to the heroes of the Old Testament. A lot of them were very tragic figures. Nietzsche was a big fan of the tragedy. One of his biggest critiques of Socrates and post-Socratic tradition was that the post-Socratic tradition went from the more pantheistic Greek tradition of tragedies, the idea that the hero was neither really good nor bad, and it transfers over to what is called Aesopian fables. And what an Aesopian fable is it usually takes place with animals, and it sort of talks about there's a moral message behind it. So like the tortoise and the hare, for example, the idea slow and steady wins the race. It's essentially a fable where there's clearly a right and clearly a wrong. And a lot of what Socrates brings to the table is that the highest good is the pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of wisdom, denying worldly pleasures. So it actually, post-Socratic Greek tradition actually worked very well in relation to Christianity, and I'm sure influenced the writing of the New Testament as well. But Nietzsche was highly critical of this as well. He was highly critical of post-Socratic tradition because he felt it denied the more human aspects of our existence and was sort of putting more stock into this very black and white interpretation of morality. And you see this in the heroes. The heroes of pre-Socratic tradition, for example, Homer's Iliad, Odysseus, Achilles, they were neither really good nor bad. And it's funny because you even look at the Iliad with Hector. Hector wasn't necessarily the hero of the Iliad, and he was a very good guy in comparison to Achilles, at least, who was more selfish. But Achilles was the central hero of the Iliad. So this is another reason I think that Nietzsche is more favorable of the Old Testament. The heroes of the Old Testament represented more nuance, like Samson or David or any of the kings, really, of Israel. Most of them, I can't, off the top of my head, I can't think of a king who wasn't flawed. But anyway, this is just to illustrate a quick tidbit. So when you look at Christian morality, Christianity has dominated Europe and European morality for the past 1,500 years, and of course it's died down a lot, which is where Nietzsche comes in, like God is dead and we have killed him. But let's just look at that and how it's impacted our current morality of this time. So, interesting enough, in many ways, having a functional slave morality actually supports power structures of the masters, and I'll get into that. So I've kind of gone on a bit of a tangent, but just getting back to what we're talking about. Essentially, when you have these two main classes, the master class and the slave class, and this manifests itself very differently throughout history. Early on in history, the master class were those with power, the warriors and the priests, and the slave class were like the merchants and the laborers. But today, it's become much more economic. In the past, it was much more based on like martial prowess, on the ability to wage warfare, and that was actually an integral part of the master class. So you look at the knights of feudal Europe or the samurai of Japan, the aristocracy were those who could wage war. There were, especially early on in medieval tradition, or medieval history, I should say, most of the armies were made up of knights, and there wasn't a lot of participation from the peasants in warfare. It was mainly the aristocratic, knightly warrior class, and same goes for Japan until later when they started using more ashigaru, which were the peasant soldiers. So warfare, I think, is what sort of defined the masters of the past, whereas today it's all economics. The master class is the bourgeois, and then the slave class is the proletariat. I think it's quite interesting because if you look at a lot of the post-Enlightenment ideological movements, so liberalism, for example, and then communism, which I think are the two things that sort of branch out from the Enlightenment, a lot of their ideology is based on economics. It's based on this relationship between the proletariat and the bourgeois. So the bourgeois being the master class and the proletariat being the slave class. Whereas in the past, this distinction was more based on martial prowess, was more based on actual, like, almost a metaphysical view of power, which is through warfare. Whereas today it's economics, and there's a lot of issues that come from the power structures being based on economics, because I think that, when you have an aristocratic warrior class, there's more of an incentive to stay strong, to sort of not get too lost in comfort and the pleasures that come from your position. Whereas today, since it's all based on economics, it's a lot easier to get lost into pleasure, into comfort, into consumerism and materialism, right? But that's a discussion for another time. I went off on another tangent there. But we see this idea early on with morality. And this is in the Genealogy of Morals, what kind of Nietzsche talks about the creditors and the debtors, right? So the creditors are those with power, and the debtors are those without power. And this particular example is sort of relating to the more economic relationship between the two. So if you're a creditor, you have the money and you can loan that money to the debtor. But once you have loaned the money to the debtor, they are in your service. They have to pay that money back. And if they can't pay that money back, then you have this position over them. You have this moral authority over them because they need to pay you back. They owe you, and you sort of begin to own them as they owe you. So that's this sort of distinction again in regards to how morality developed, and how, like, the slave class developed in relation to the master class. It was this idea that the masters had something to give to the slaves, and the slaves had to give it back somehow, and it creates this odd dynamic, right, where you have it is almost like ownership. And while it may not be exactly literal slavery, it often, that's where, master and slave morality, while we can't get too hung up on the words are used for a reason. And it's this idea of crime versus punishment, right? You have the creditor with the power, and he's using his power to help those without power, help those without money, the debtor. And if the debtor does not fulfill the proper reciprocation of that, so let's say you get loaned $10,000, if you don't pay that back with interest on time, then there needs to be punishment. So there's this, over time, mentally, there's this idea of, okay, well, I have to serve the person in the position of power well, otherwise I will be punished. So it's this dynamic of the powerful and the powerless, the powerful and the weak, the strong and the weak. And it's this idea that those with power have something to give to those without power, and those without power has to reciprocate, has to pay them back. And it creates this power dynamic, right? And in many ways, this could be a very bad thing. And it has proven itself to be a bad thing when someone abuses his power over the individual in the bottom. And this is kind of how morality develops, right? And I think one of the main differences with slave morality is you're sort of replacing the master of the individual with a godly master, right? In slave morality, you are repaying God to an extent. God has given you life, and you are repaying him through trying to live a virtuous life so you can receive eternal reward in the afterlife. Whereas in these more master moralities, the master is a human individual. And of course, even within slave morality, a lot of people found ways to abuse slave morality to their own purposes. So you have the priestly classes, and even the knightly classes and the monarchical classes of medieval Europe. They took what was a slave morality and use it to their advantages. So medieval monarchs, for example, medieval kings, were believed to have divine right to rule by God. So it was believed that God picked them to be his guardians on earth. Therefore, they sort of abused the slave morality by giving themselves a divine right to rule, right? And same with like the priestly classes and like the papacy. So while if you take, I think, the Bible literally, there should be this direct connection between a Christian and God, but then you start to have a lot of these mediums that go in between that. Like you have God at the top and the Christian at the bottom, but then there's a lot of mediums that developed when I don't think they necessarily are supposed to be. And this can go into a whole theological debate that I'm not currently prepared to have. Let me know in the comments. But once you have more mediums, so you have priest, for example, you have the kings, you have the papacy, it allows them to replace God as the master in this master and slave dynamic, right? And it's interesting. So like, you see economics kind of play a part in this. Again, you have indulgences, right? The medium, the middle ground people, the aristocracy can abuse their power by buying indulgences. So if you don't know what an indulgence is essentially you pay a certain amount of money to the church and they forgive you of your sins. So it's this idea that power actually gets you higher up within this religious doctrine, right? And this is a very bad thing, obviously. And it's sort of like the master morality finding its way into a slave morality, finding a way to abuse it for their own end, and in many ways making themselves more powerful because of it, because the slaves in the slave morality believe that they are functioning well, and I'll talk about this more. They believe that they are doing what they need to do, and they're going to be rewarded in the afterlife for it. And the masters are still able to abuse this power structure to their advantage. And this is a lot of the reason why you have divisions within the church. The first big division, obviously, was the Great Schism with the Orthodox Church breaking away from the Catholic Church. But more specifically, to illustrate my example, is when Martin Luther began the Protestant movement, and you have all these different breakings from the Catholic Church. Obviously, the Protestants led by Martin Luther, and then you have also the Church of England for different reasons. But specifically in relation to Martin Luther, one of his big criticisms of the Catholic Church was that masses were given in Latin. The Christians or Catholics couldn't read the Bible, either because it wasn't in their language or they just couldn't read. Therefore, it allowed this medium to completely interpret God's message to the slaves, to the slave class. It allowed the priestly class to interpret the message exactly how they wanted to the slave class. And this was something that Martin Luther was very critical about. He was very critical that the priestly class could essentially subvert the message of God however they wanted and potentially for their own gain. So Martin Luther, one of his big things that he wanted to change was, well, he wanted to increase literacy rates among Christians, and he wanted the Bible and masses to be given or written in the native languages of the Christians who were reading the Bible or going to Mass. So you see, for example, in the early American colonies, most of the people who first came over from Britain to America were Puritans, and Puritans were Protestants, and they had a very high literacy rate because of the Lutheran tradition of being able to read the Bible, getting the word directly from the source rather than from a priest. So much of the early colonists in America were very intelligent because they could all read, because they had to read, because that was sort of part of their specific religious sect. Their religious faction believed very much in directly interacting with the Bible and with God. So that's one of the ways that you see slave morality developing, right? And developing in a way that actually benefited the masters. And this goes a lot into what Nietzsche talks about in regards to the word ressentiment that I mentioned earlier. So essentially what ressentiment is when you have a master class and a slave class. And let's take away religion for a second. Let's just see this dynamic of master class and slave class. Ressentiment is the anger and jealousy of the slave class towards the master class. So like I said, master morality is based upon values first and enemies second, whereas the slave morality is based on enemies first and then values based on the opposite traits of your enemy. Therefore, of course, the weak, what they see as evil and what they see as bad is power and strength and wealth and success. So resentment is the jealousy and contempt of the weak towards the strong. And without religion, you just have those at the bottom hating those at the top because those at the top have power and those at the bottom do not have that power. Now, you add religion into the mix, right? So there's two ways that this can manifest. Either, well, you can look at Christianity and say, okay, well, God, or the Bible is very critical of those with power and those with great amounts of wealth, so we need to tear them down and just create one slave class of everybody. That's one way to look at it. But how it really manifested itself, and this is actually something Nietzsche sees as a positive, was the priestly class developing and being able to redirect the resentment, being able to redirect the jealousy and the anger towards the powerful class by religion. So it's instead of blaming the masters for having the slaves endure suffering and hardship, the priests were able to tell the slave class, well, it's a good thing that you're enduring pain and suffering. It's a good thing that you are in a position of weakness, because that's going to give you eternal reward in the afterlife. Therefore, instead of directing their jealousy and contempt and anger towards the master class, they redirected it inwards and saw it as a positive thing. So the priestly class was actually very helpful for the master class, because it allowed the master class to continue holding their power and holding their wealth, because the slave class, the weaker class, the poorer class now saw their suffering and hardship as a good thing. Therefore, there was a lot more social stability, and there wasn't as much desire for them to take the master class from their pedestal. And then, it's interesting because we see what Nietzsche calls the death of God. I think that comes from the Enlightenment, because it's this idea that all men are equal. I think the Enlightenment, whether organically, I would say probably unintentionally, sort of starts to build the building blocks of dividing humans by economics. Because once you have the growth of commercialism and you have the Industrial Revolution, economics plays a lot more of a role in regards to power. Without sort of these metaphysical, spiritual, social hierarchies, which is like the king's divine right to rule, which is from the priest's divine right to interpret the word of God. And obviously, it's not really supposed to be that way. That's how it manifested itself many times throughout history. But it's this idea that essentially, power isn't just based on economics and wealth. It's based on martial prowess. But with the Enlightenment, you start to see the growth of individuals with lots of money having lots of power, especially with the growth of democracy. So you look at the American democracy that developed. You have all these individuals with positions of political power, but none of them come from the nobility. They just have a lot of money. They have lots of farms. They have trade companies, import companies, export companies. Later on, they're building factories during the Industrial Revolution. So you have the wealthy people becoming the powerful people. You have those with money, the bourgeois, becoming the master class. And then you have the proletariat, the worker, the one who doesn't have the means, who doesn't own the means of production, the ones at the bottom working for the bourgeois. They are the slave class. And this leads to a lot of problems, because what this really does is when you have religion, and specifically Judeo-Christianity, being the basis for morality in Europe, it creates a social hierarchy that's built upon metaphysical lines, that's based upon something spiritual. But, I think that a big contributor to the death of God in Nietzsche's interpretation is this shift from a social hierarchy based on the metaphysical to a social hierarchy purely based upon economics for the most part. And that I think contributes to the death of God that we see today. And like I mentioned earlier, you have the growth. You have two main political groups that come out of the Enlightenment, that are inspired by the Enlightenment. You have liberalism, which advocates for individual liberties, individual freedoms, a free market. And then you have communism, or specifically, let's say Marxism, which advocates for planned economy, which advocates for complete egalitarianism, complete equality, for giving the proletariat the means of production. So essentially getting rid of the bourgeois specifically. So the main differences between liberalism and Marxism is liberalism believes more in meritocracy, like the proletariat can become the bourgeois through hard work, through the free market, while the Marxist system believes that this is a fairy tale and a fantasy, and that the proletariat can't, or it is very difficult for the proletariat to actually get into the class of the bourgeois, so they believe in class warfare and getting rid of the bourgeois specifically. And then it's interesting because you have the third big movement of the 20th century, fascism, which is a reaction to the Enlightenment in so many ways. And what fascism is trying to do is almost, reinstituting the social hierarchies of the past, this sort of metaphysical, spiritual social hierarchy. So you see, economics is a lot less important in fascism, and that's interesting because they're the only one of the three that we're trying to push a a elitist system that was based on metaphysics rather than economics. Whereas, the Marxists were trying to get rid of elitist hierarchies completely, obviously unsuccessfully. Read Animal Farm by George Orwell if you want to see how that ends up turning out in Marxism. And then you have the liberal tradition, which ended up defeating both fascism and Marxism, and the liberal tradition believing in a very, still kind of an elitist system, but a very fluid elitist system. So you have, I'm trying to think of the word, basically class fluidity in liberalism, you have class harmony in fascism, and then you have class warfare in Marxism. And it's interesting how all these different ideologies came about and how they are sort of either reacting to the Enlightenment, building off of one aspect of the Enlightenment, or completely taking a different interpretation of the Enlightenment. But the reason I bring that up is because, when we talk about the death of God for Nietzsche, it's this idea that the resentment that the worker, the slave class, the weak class has, is no longer redirected by the priest towards themselves. Once you have the death of God, once you have the death of God, the slave class no longer is saying, okay, this pain and suffering is good because I'm going to go to heaven because of this pain and suffering. It goes from that to, wait a minute, I want to live. I want to have some equality in this life, or I want to take down the masters in this life. I want to overthrow them. I want to take them down. And like I said, it manifests in two different ways, either liberalism or Marxism. So, liberalism, like I said, it's the idea that there can be more class fluidity. So you have, the American democracy and, just democracy in general. And then Marxism, I think, and one of the reasons I would say is a very big critique Nietzsche would have of Marxism is this idea that Marxism is the complete embodiment of slave morality. It's all based upon class warfare. It's all based on the proletariat coming up and getting completely rid of the master class and defeating them entirely and building a state where everyone's a proletariat, or at least that's how it's supposed to be. Again, read Animal Farm. It never works out that way. Marxism, maybe it could work. A lot of neo-Marxists are like, communism just hasn't been successfully implemented yet. I think that it's impossible. I don't think that communism can ever be successfully implemented because I think it is in human nature to have a will to power, as Nietzsche would put it. Humans want power. Humans want to be powerful. And if you completely negate the human condition and the desire of power, you have what happens in the Soviet Union. Even though the class system is not based on economics, it becomes based upon just pure power. And a lot of times those with power are going to become economically powerful anyway. So it's interesting. So you look at fascism compared to Marxism, really what Marxism devolves into, it really turns into fascism in many ways. Not necessarily the ultra-nationalistic aspect of fascism, although it does sometimes. Look at China. But it turns into that idea that you just have social hierarchies that are no longer based on economics, right? So it's interesting, but Nietzsche would be highly critical of Marxism, and I'm sure he was, but it wasn't as big when he was around because there was no real Marxist state yet. But he would be very critical of that because it was the embodiment of the slave class and slave morality going up and tearing the masters down. And like I said, Nietzsche doesn't necessarily take a side between master and slave morality, but a lot of his philosophy is very critical of slave morality because he believes that the world has existed in a position of slave morality for most of the recent history. So Ressentiment, like I said, and I wrote down something that I think I want to read out just because I think it was. This is something that I found online, which I think really explains Ressentiment pretty well, and then I wrote my own interpretation of this. So it's defined online as a psychological state arising from suppressed feelings of envy and hatred that cannot be acted upon, frequently resulting in some form of self-abasement. So it's essentially when you're weak and there's people that are powerful and you feel powerless to sort of, get to that position of power or take them down from power. So once you have the ability to take them from power, you're going to act on it. And that's what you see in like the Bolshevik Revolution, for example, or the French Revolution. Those in the slave classes in the French Revolution, for example, you have the aristocracy, and you have all the poor French people. Marie Antoinette says, let them eat cake, and they're living in finery and luxury, and the working class of France say no more. And, they make up 95% of the population, and they storm the Bastille and eventually behead the king and queen, right? That's resentment, this anger. And once, like it says in the definition, hatred that cannot be acted upon. But once it can be acted upon, they're right there. Without religion, in this case, in the case of Europe, Christianity, getting the slave class to push that anger, that resentment inward, they push it outward towards the master class. And then some things I wrote down about resentment. Religion served as an effective tool to redirect the slave class's resentment from the powerful to themselves. Instead of blaming their suffering on others, for example, the more powerful classes, religion tells them that their suffering should be directed inward, that suffering is a necessary condition for salvation in the afterlife. This way, the slave class endures suffering for eternal reward after death, rather than seeking to direct the anger of their suffering and resentment towards the upper classes through conflict and war. Marxism is a perfect example of resentment without religion. Marx called religion the opiate of the masses, as it held them, the proletariat or working class, back from sparking class warfare with the bourgeoisie, the wealthier and more powerful classes. While Nietzsche is critical of religion, he admits its effectiveness at holding back the resentment of the slave class for much of human history. He does, however, acknowledge that the priestly class, which uses religion to alleviate the slave resentment, is only treating a symptom by redirecting the slave resentment from suffering inward, but not actually curing the issue. And that's the kicker right there. The religion often just serves as treating a symptom, and the symptom being this resentment. So unless you find a way to completely get rid of the resentment, you're just treating a symptom by telling the slave class to redirect their suffering inward, right? So I think it's important as a Christian to not get caught into this sort of slave resentment, and that's something that I think that a lot of Christians have trouble with, right? You get too happy with or not too happy necessarily, but too comfortable with specific dynamics. For example, the dynamic of being, putting yourself in a position where you are the weaker individual, you are in the slave class. If you're too comfortable with that, eventually the treatment is no longer going to work, and you're going to have all this anger towards those in the top rather than just rising up yourself, right? And getting to the top, which I think is something that Nietzsche would advocate for, not just accepting this position at the bottom, but actually trying to rise up. And obviously, liberalism tries to answer this problem by, in their eyes, making it possible through social mobility to rise up economically. But we see many issues with that as well. You see, really, and I think one of the biggest issues with liberalism today is you now do have a sort of elitist system. You do have a new social hierarchy. It's just completely defined by economics, and this comes about really badly because people in general don't want to be defined by economics. People are more comfortable being defined by something metaphysical because, it gives them this idea that they do have meaning. People don't find meaning in economics. Like they always say, like the richest people aren't the happiest. They're often less happy than the poor people. Well, why is that? Because money doesn't buy happiness. Economics and being defined by economics, whether it be your economic contribution or your economic consumption, are never going to give you meaning. And I think that's what, this also kind of builds into what Nietzsche talks about, like money is treating a symptom, but it's not going to get rid of the problem. It's not the cure. So I think that same with religion, if you use religion purely to deal with like hatred, then first of all, you're not really, you're not digesting religion properly. And second of all, you're never going to get rid of the actual issue, which is your hatred. You should learn not to feel hatred instead of saying, okay, well, this jealousy, I'm just going to pull it inward. It's okay. I'm going to endure suffering and hardship, and I'm going to go to heaven for it, rather than, let's say, using your pain and suffering and hardship for good things, using that, what could possibly be negative energy, and using it towards something positive, using that that suffering you have and saying, okay, well, I endured this suffering. I can endure anything. I can start my own business, or I can go to school and work my way through college, or I'm going to get that job that everyone told me I couldn't get, or you know what I mean, or following your dreams, whatever, right? But you can pull it inward, but don't pull it inward the way that you're turtling up emotions. Instead, use that. Bring it inward and then push it outward instead of just pulling it inward and keeping it there, if that makes sense. But I'm not a psychologist, so what the hell do I know, right? This is just my thoughts. So I covered a good amount of stuff today in regards to this, and I think I'll start wrapping up the video. I'm just going to go through my notes really quick just to see if there's anything else that I want to bring up. I think that with the death of God, as Nietzsche talks about, especially in Christian tradition, as I've mentioned, there's this idea that God will bring revenge upon the people who mistreated you in this life. And when you don't have religion anymore, when you don't have the strength of religion, you don't have religious authority being strong, then people are no longer waiting for God to bring vengeance upon the evil in the afterlife. They're going to take it upon themselves to get this revenge in this life. So you see Bolshevik Revolution, the French Revolution, etc. Right? So that's I think something to consider. What else? Can't really think of anything else. I wrote a bunch of notes down, looking through them to see if there's anything else I'd like to mention. I think that I did a fairly decent job of talking about what I wanted to talk about, but just really quick, looking through my notes, seeing if there's anything else I want to talk about. There's actually something interesting. I'll find it really quick if I can find the specific quote I wrote down about slave morality in general. It was something along the lines of like with slave morality, it requires like a sort of hostile world to build their values, because like I said, it's reactionary, right? There we go. Slave morality always first needs a hostile external world. It needs, physiologically speaking, external stimuli in order to act at all. Its actions fundamentally are a reaction. So that's kind of what I'm talking about in regards to how Nietzsche views slave morality as first needing an enemy, needing something to criticize, and building their values and their morality based in opposition to that enemy, to that thing they hate, right? To what they perceive as evil. So, yeah, just to like, if I had to really simply summarize it, master morality is creating good first and evil later, and slave morality is creating evil first and good later. And again, Nietzsche's almost like magnus opus is called Beyond Good and Evil. When I use the words good and evil, I'm not talking about like our sort of moral absolutist view of good and evil. I'm not talking about murder being good or evil. I'm talking about what a specific group considers good and evil, and what another group considers evil and good, right? So when I'm using those words, try to get beyond good and evil, try to get beyond our contemporary moral absolutism, and try to look at it through more of a moral relativist. I'm not telling you to be a moral relativist, but when you have to look at how Nietzsche uses words, you have to look at it through sort of a morally relativistic mindset. But this is an interesting topic. It was a really good book. I'm taking a little break from Nietzsche. I'm actually reading some authors inspired by Nietzsche right now. So I've read 4 books by Nietzsche so far. I've read Beyond Good and Evil is the first one I finished, then Birth of Tragedy, then Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and then Genealogy of Morals. I've read a good amount of Will to Power. I don't know what I'm going to read next. If you have any suggestions or recommendations for my next Nietzsche book, shoot them down in the comments. If you watch the video for this long, I salute you for your patience and focus. It's good to be back. Obviously, I've been really busy this past month, really, because I was on a 2-week work trip for the military, and then this week I've been working a lot at my second job as a bouncer. I had like 5 shifts this week, plus I was still doing my regular military work day. I had a battalion hike on Friday, 24-hour duty was it Sunday, so it was 2 days ago. So I've been really busy. So I'm just trying to get back into the flow of things. My past 2 videos, I didn't have my mic. Well, so my video, which was Why the West is Falling. I just didn't have my mic in general because I was on my work trip. And my last video, for some reason, the mic wasn't connected properly, even though I had it in my computer. I guess the input wasn't correct, so that wasn't working, but whatever. We live and we learn, we move forward. But as always, thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting the channel as usual. Of course, always, I love interacting with you guys, so leave your thoughts in the comment section, hop on the Discord server and shoot me a message. I'll try to get to it when I can. Just some updates. I might be going away for a few months in June. It's still not 100% sure, but I might be gone in about a month for 3 months, in which case I won't be able to be making videos during that time, maybe a couple if I have internet, but most likely I will not be able to post a lot of videos from like June to September timeframe, or more like July to October timeframe. So I'm gonna try to be making a good amount of videos this month so that y'all have something to watch while I'm gone. But thanks for watching. I hope y'all are doing well. It's good to be back making some content. And as always, this is the Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the warrior philosophy. I'll see you next time.